Hello and welcome to another marvelous video. I'm your host Will. Everyone loves a good scare, right? That's why horror films are such a staple of pop culture. But what if there are some films that are so disturbing, so gory, and yet you probably never even heard of? In this video, I'm gonna go over 10 such horror films and why you should watch them. Let's get to it, shall we? Do you remember the run of horror films during the 70s and 80s? Classics like Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, and The Thing were all coming out during this period and casually redefining horror in cinema. As such, horror films from the 90s don't often get the acclaim they deserve, overshadowed by the more popular decades of horror. A lot of the films of the era were seen as cheesy continuations of 80s franchises. But if you delve deep enough, you'll find some obscure, truly disturbing gems hiding behind the popular films. If you're a horror fan like me, then I've made this list of underrated horror films from the 90s just for you, so that you too can enjoy some of the finest horror flicks from the era.
My enemies, you are no longer Boone. You are Cabal.
Jacob's Ladder. In 1971, Jacob Singer is an infantryman fighting in the Vietnam War, where he is grievously wounded in the line of duty. 4 years later, Jacob lives with his new girlfriend Jezebel in New York, working as a postal worker, as he begins to suffer from recurring hallucinations, which makes him see terrifying creatures and visions. Thus begins the story of Jacob's Ladder, a dark, psychological horror drama released in 1990, directed by Adrian Lyne. We follow Jacob as he initially dismisses the hallucinations, only to discover that his former comrades in the infantry all seem to be suffering from these same hallucinations, which lead to all of them becoming suspicious of what exactly happened during their tour of Vietnam. The twists and turns that follow will have Jacob and us, the audience, questioning his sanity as his world starts coming apart around him. Compared to the slasher films of the previous era, Jacob's Ladder is, in my opinion, a horror film more focused on the drama of the characters than merely frightening you. But worry not, it's still very scary, and it definitely frightened me alongside many others, one of them being Masahiro Ito, the creative mind behind the Silent Hill series of horror games, who took inspiration from this movie while making the famous Silent Hill video game series. You can even see some enemies in the games that were directly inspired by this film. But despite its influence on pop culture, it seems to have been forgotten by the general audience. But if you watch it now, nearly 35 years since its release, you'll find, just like I did, that it holds up really well for a horror film made in 1990. Hardware, 1990. Hardware, released in 1990, is a film that you could only see made in the 90s. Despite the lower than usual budget, the filmmakers created a version of Earth destroyed by radiation that feels gritty and grimy in a way that you don't see modern CGI-heavy movies replicate. The story follows Mo, a slum dweller who buys a robot head for his girlfriend on a whim from a nomad. His girlfriend, Jill, uses the head on a sculpture she was working on. Unknown to both of them, the robot head is a Mark 13, capable of self-repair, which it does using the raw materials Jill uses to make her sculptures. Mo and Jill find themselves in a cat and mouse chase for survival, with the crazed killer robot killing everything in its path as it goes on a killing spree throughout the slum. The film is notorious for its gore, which was so extreme that it initially earned an X, you'd know it now as NC-17 rating, and had to be cut up and censored to make it eligible for an R rating. What made the film comparatively less popular is perhaps the fact that it wears its influences on its sleeves. If you've seen any science fiction movie, chances are you can predict the plot of this movie pretty accurately. A killer robot from a post-apocalyptic wasteland is hunting down a girl. Now, where have you heard that before? In fact, the film was sued for plagiarism of another story from Judge Dredd Annual 1981 titled Shock, and subsequently gave its authors credit for the original story. If you're in the mood for a gory sci-fi horror movie, you could do a lot worse than Hardware, if you can stomach it, that is. Nightbreed, 1990. Clive Barker is one of the more prolific horror writers of our time, with many of his works being adapted into horror films. You might best know him for his dark and disturbing Hellraiser franchise, the first film of which he directed based on his own novella. So when people heard he had a new film, Nightbreed, coming out that he's directing, also based on a book of his, it's no surprise that people were excited. However, what we got is something stranger, and in my opinion, more interesting. We follow Aaron Boone, a troubled young man who is framed by his psychologist, played by famed horror director David Cronenberg in a chilling performance, for his serial murders. While escaping from the police, he stumbles upon the mythical place of Midian, where mysterious and monstrous-looking creatures called the Nightbreed dwell. Boone soon finds himself becoming one of them as an outcast of human society, and discovers that despite their appearance, they are actually peaceful people who are constantly hunted by humans who fear them. Despite what you may think the film is like, being a Clive Barker adaptation, the film is more a dark fantasy story than a slasher horror film that it was initially advertised as. Fans of the X-Men might particularly enjoy this movie, as both series deal with heroic yet monstrous-looking heroes dealing with human prejudice and hatred as they attempt to live a peaceful existence. Clive Barker's works always asked us to empathize with the downtrodden and the outcasts, and it's fitting that Nightbreed, a film about outcasts that failed to achieve mainstream success, still found an audience in the cult following it received after release. The Resurrected, 1992. If I had to guess, I'd say that at least 90% of you would have heard of the Alien film franchise. It is, after all, one of the most famous science fiction horror stories of all time. And similarly, H.P. Lovecraft is a major figure in horror literature, with his works creating a whole new genre of horror named after him. But what if I told you that one of the architects of the Alien films made a direct adaptation of a Lovecraft story that no one today even remembers? You'd say that's probably the film you're talking about right now, and you'd be right. That film is The Resurrected, 1992, directed by Dan O'Bannon, the writer behind the original Alien, 1979. The film is an adaptation of The Case of Charles Alexander Ward. Set in modern-day America, the film follows Charles Alexander Ward, a man who discovers dark secrets regarding his past and getting caught up in black magic and dark rituals that unleash horrors upon his life and town. If you're familiar with Lovecraft's works, you know they often deal with creatures beyond our understanding that often drive people insane, and thus are often hard to adapt into a visual medium like film. However, I think you'll agree with me that O'Bannon's direction in the film proves that he understands the source material. He knows that Lovecraftian horror needs more than just grotesque monsters and violence. The creature effects on display elicit a feeling of disgust and dread in me that I know the monster aficionados watching this will appreciate. But if you ask me, none of it would be as effective without Chris Sarandon as Charles Alexander Ward. He fully commits to the insanity of the character and delivers a memorably chilling performance. Of all the films in this list, this is the one I'll be most surprised if you knew about already. Let us know in the comments down below if you did. Tetsuo 2, Body Hammer. The Japanese film industry is home to some of the most films I've ever seen in my life. If I had to pick one Japanese director whose film you should watch, it'd be Shinya Tsukamoto and his film Tetsuo 2, Body Hammer. We follow Taniguchi Tomo, a salaryman who finds himself changing after receiving a mysterious injection from a group of cultists, led by a man named Yatsu. He finds himself turning into a mechanical human hybrid, a living weapon who fights for the survival of his family. He is opposed by Yatsu, who plans to use the injection to destroy the whole world as we know it. The film is, in my opinion, one of the most bizarre works in cyberpunk fiction I've ever seen, with the boundary between flesh and metal slowly being erased as the protagonist changes throughout the story. The editing and pace of the film feels less like a traditional film and more like a nightmare that you would jolt awake from. Tetsuo 2, Body Hammer is a remake of his earlier film, Tetsuo, the Iron Man, but Tsukamoto used the budget to create what is, in my opinion, a unique blend of cyberpunk action and gruesome body horror. In the Mouth of Madness, 1994. A titan of horror cinema. If John Carpenter makes a horror film, then we are obliged as horror fans to see it. From Halloween to The Thing, he is potentially the Hollywood director who influenced the horror genre the most. Despite this, In the Mouth of Madness remains one of his underappreciated works, and I aim to correct that. John Trent, an insurance investigator who is assigned to find the whereabouts of mysterious horror author Sutter Kane and his manuscript for his latest book titled In the Mouth of Madness. As Trent searches for him with the help of Kane's editor Linda Stiles, he discovers unnatural and unexplainable occurrences surrounding Sutter Kane and the town of Hobbs End, which bear an eerie resemblance to what Kane had written in his manuscript for In the Mouth of Madness. Now you may be wondering, wait, they're reading the book the movie is based on? And trust me, that is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how mind-bending this film gets. The film delights in using metafiction to confuse us, the audience, just as much as it confuses and terrifies the main character. The final scene, which I will not spoil here, and I ask you not to spoil as well in the comment section, is probably the most bonkers and insane ending in a horror film ever. Cemetery Man, Della Morte dell'Amore, 1994. Imagine working as a cemetery caretaker, tending to the graves of the deceased, when one day, the dead begin to rise from their graves. This might be the scariest event you've ever witnessed, but for Rupert Everett's Francesco Della Morte, it's just another day at the job. Cemetery Man, known in Italy as Della Morte dell'Amore, is one of the darkest horror comedies to come out of Italy. The film follows Della Morte, who works in a cemetery in the small Italian town of Buffalora, where the dead sometimes return as zombies that Della Morte calls returners. It is up to Della Morte to kill and bury them again, with a local government either too incompetent or bureaucratic to actually help. In Della Morte's words, it's easier to just shoot them. Cemetery Man is part of the rare breed of horror comedies where the comedy actually adds to the creepy nature of the film. You'll find yourself laughing at things that in other films would make you feel disgust or horror, and you'll then wonder why you were laughing at such a dark thing. Horror and comedy both work by eliciting a reaction from their audience, and I believe Cemetery Man is one of the rare films that is able to be both funny and horrifying at the same time. Castle Freak, 1995. The true horror fans amongst you will already know, but straight-to-video releases have some of the more underrated hidden gems of the horror genre. Of these, none exemplifies the pulpy violence of the genre more than 1995's Castle Freak, directed by Stuart Gordon, who was already infamous for his violent yet campy horror films like Reanimator. Castle Freak is another one of his films that plays on the campy B-movie sensibilities of older horror movies. The film follows John and Susan Riley and their blind daughter Rebecca as they go to Italy to live in the castle John recently inherited from a duchess. Unbeknownst to them, the Duchess's son, Giorgio Orsino, is still in the dungeons of the castle, where he was imprisoned and tortured. We follow the family as they try to survive Giorgio's wrath, which are shown in all their gory detail. Right from the title itself, you know exactly what kind of movie you're in for. A low-brow, violent, and gory horror flick. Yet even within this low-budget genre, Gordon and his lead actors, Jeffrey Combs and Barbara Crampton, managed to make a minor classic of the genre. Their performances give the movie an unexpected humanity, which allows us to actually care for their fates, unlike other horror movies where a character might be so annoying that you actively root for their death. Even Giorgio is given a sympathetic backstory behind his imprisonment and torture by his own mother, the Duchess, which gives the film a touch of tragedy as well. The film is a loose adaptation of Lovecraft's The Outsider, which also follows a person who was trapped in a castle his entire life, escaping and seeking out other humans. I'll be the first to admit that Castle Freak is not a complicated film, but there is something about its simplicity that makes its horror and violence that much more fun for me, and I hope for you as well. The Addiction, 1995. Compared to the other films on the list here, The Addiction might seem out of place. It's slightly more highbrow in taste, being a black and white exploration of the nature of addiction, here seen as a vampiric addiction to blood. The film follows a young philosophy student, Kathleen, who is bitten by a strange woman at night, and soon finds herself overcome by cravings for blood. Kathleen soon finds herself changing, not just physically into a vampire, but emotionally as well, as she begins to do whatever she can to get more blood to quench her thirst. You might find its art house sensibilities not suited to your tastes, but if you give it a chance, you'll see a film that horrifies you not with monsters, but with mundane, everyday problems that you might otherwise not notice around you. Stylistically and narratively, the film is a major departure from what horror films are typically like, which I feel like the film uses to its benefit. Without the glamorization of the vampiric curse, you can see just how horrific being a vampire and addiction are. The most famous scenes would be the cameo by Christopher Walken, who, in a mere 10 minutes of screen time, steals the show with his portrayal of a vampire who has learned to overcome his urges. Director Abel Ferreira is famous for his philosophical dramas, and used the framework of the vampire horror film to explore heavy topics like drug addiction, abuse, and the idea of sin. I recommend watching the film just to see Ferreira's vision of New York, which looks identical to real life but is haunted by these vampires, struggling to live as themselves without giving in to their base instincts. Event Horizon, 1997. In the, back then, far future of 2047, an experimental ship is created that uses an experimental gravity drive to travel large distances almost instantaneously, named the Event Horizon. However, when the Event Horizon suddenly appears near Neptune, a distress signal from the ship itself prompts a group of astronauts to explore and figure out what happened to the crew of the Event Horizon. This is a basic premise of Paul W.S. Anderson's Event Horizon, 1997, a science fiction horror film like nothing else you will ever see released that year. You'll think you've seen this film before. It takes influence from many science fiction franchises that came before, but then the film reaches a fever pitch and reveals what actually happened to the crew of the Event Horizon. To let you understand the full impact of what you'll see, I'll let you know that the resulting footage is so extreme and horrifying that the scene itself is chopped up by the creators to allow for an R rating of the film. Hell, the full footage of what was cut is now lost forever. According to Paul W.S. Anderson, all that remains are the small fragments of the footage that are spliced into the theatrical cut. The film reveals that the event Horizon, by using the gravitational drive, is actually traveling through hell itself, with the result of this interdimensional travel being the mass psychosis that came over the crew, which led to them defiling and mutilating each other. What makes the film so interesting to me is that it replaces a physical threat with a more existential one. The hell sequence is stuck in my mind for how horrifying it is, not just the visuals of the tortured crew members, but how powerless they were to prevent it. Those were just 10 horror films from a decade that were filled with unique and interesting horror films. Each film on the list is one that I personally felt disturbed by, either by their visual effects, themes, or just how bleak the situation was. Thank you for sticking with us and watching the whole video. If you feel like we left out some important films from the era, please feel free to comment and let us know. And if you find your next midnight movie in this list, feel free to show your appreciation by giving us a like and subscribing. Till next time.